choice. As humans, we make choices every day, but how many of them actually have a large impact on our lives? There may never be a time in our lives where we must choose between life and death, whether it be our own or someone else's. However, for the Native Americans living in the 13 colonies during the Revolutionary War, they were faced with a choice that could change both their lives and history forever. In America, the Revolution was a difficult period for everyone involved. With war raging on across the colonies, many towns found themselves stuck in the middle of a battlefield. However, this did not only affect the colonists, but also affected the lives of the Native Americans already living there. After the colonists came onto their land and settled it, they continued to make the natives' lives difficult by starting a war with Britain on their land. Now stuck in the middle of a war, the tribes throughout the countryside were faced with a decision: side with the British, side with the Patriots, or try to remain neutral until the conflict ended. At first, the intention of the colonists was for the tribes to remain neutral in the conflict. This was given in the form of a statement delivered by the Continental Congress in 1775, which read, "This is a family quarrel between us and Old England. You Indians are not concerned in it. We don't wish you to take up the hatchet against the king's troops. We desire you to remain at home, not join either side, but keep the hatchet buried deep." Although this may have been their original intentions, this quickly changed come 1776, when both the British and colonists made an attempt to form alliances with the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy. This theme quickly spread, and shortly after the war began, tribes all throughout the colonies were just as involved in the war as the two sides fighting it. Each choice had its own positive and negative effects, and in most cases, the Indians had no control over their future. In this short documentary, we will be examining not only the Native Americans' role in the Revolution, but also why they chose to fill those roles.
The Iroquois Confederacy was, and is today, arguably the most powerful Native American confederacy in the world. Initially, much like it did during the French and Indian War, the Confederacy tried to maintain its neutrality during the conflict of the American Revolution and the ensuing war that came with it. However, this war was different. The Native Americans faced increasing pressure from both Britain and the 13 colonies to choose a side, and so they did. While 4 of the 6 nations chose to support the British, the Oneida Nation as well as the Tuscarora Nation decided to side with the American rebels. There were a couple of very important factors that went into this decision. The American Reverend Samuel Kirkland played a huge role in the Oneida Nation's decision to side with the rebels. Samuel Kirkland was appointed the Oneida's missionary in 1766, and he would quickly learn the customs and culture of the Oneida people. His religious work was not all he did for the Oneida Nation, as he became a makeshift counselor for local disputes. He would also provide needy natives with clothing and food whenever he could. Finally, he arranged for many of them to be educated and provided them with the tools necessary for agricultural work as well as carpentry work. All of these things played a role into their decision. However, arguably the biggest influence Kirkland had on the decision was when he aligned his ministry with a religious commission that was based in Boston in 1770. This brought the Oneida's attention to Boston and the potential views of the rebels who were there. As the American Revolution pressed on, the British began telling the 6 nations not to listen to the American rebels and what they were saying. But the Oneida found it hard to listen, as many of these same rebels, including Samuel Kirkland, that Britain made sound so terrible, had brought them so much good and helped them in a lot of instances and ways. And they simply were unable to believe the words of the British about the American rebels. Because of this, they sided with the American rebels, and from 1777 to 1778, they gave a lot of physical support to the American cause. On August 6, 1777, a party of Oneida scouts fought American loyalists and 6 Nations members who had allied with the British at the Battle of Oriskany. Oneida War Chief Han Yeri killed 9 enemy fighters during this battle. Later, the Oneida would send 150 men to Horatio Gates's army. These men harassed British sentry posts and foraging groups. Shortly thereafter, during the winter, 50 Oneida men were sent to Washington's army, where they were primarily used as scouts and occasionally as soldiers, as was seen at the Battle of Barren Hill in May 1778, shortly before they returned home. An Oneida woman named Polly Cooper, who came to Washington with the Oneida men, became General Washington's cook for the entirety of her time there. For the remainder of the war, the Oneida people were primarily used by the rebels as scouts, guides, and finally couriers of mail. They were scouts for various missions into Mohawk territory. This came at a price, as by 1780 they were facing increasing pressure from Loyalists and other British allied Six Nations groups. One of their main villages had been destroyed, and many Oneida had been forced to move to the area of British-controlled Fort Stanwix, just in order to survive. Some were forced to change their allegiance, although the rebels considered the Oneida their allies up until the very end of the war. After the war ended, many Oneida people were given restitution by the newly formed American government in 1794, but in the end they paid a large price for siding with the American rebels. Much like the Oneida alliance with the rebels centered around Reverend Samuel Kirkland, the Mohawk alliance with the British centered around Sir William Johnson. He had built an empire in the Mohawk Valley because of his dealings with the Indians, and due to the way that he immersed himself in Indian culture, he was adopted by the Mohawk Nation. This was in large part why the Mohawk and three other Iroquois nations, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, ultimately decided to ally with the British during the Revolution. The largest role played by a Mohawk in the war was by Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant. Over the course of the war, Brant had become a captain in the British Army and was also one of their perceived leaders. He would carry out raids on American rebels who lived on farms on New York's frontier. The goal of these raids was to stop supplies from getting to General Washington's army. These raids, where farms were destroyed by Loyalists and their native allies, were quite frequent during the war. These raids, which sometimes turned into massacres of American rebels, were not looked fondly upon by the American rebels. Joseph Brant became known as Monster Brant, as the American rebels considered him responsible for both the Cherry Valley and Wyoming Valley massacres, although most accounts today dispute this claim. Among the rebels, the Mohawks were regarded as savages because of their actions during these raids and attacks on New York's frontier, raids in which many innocent people were killed by Mohawk Indians and other members of the British allied tribes. Because of Mohawk and other Iroquois actions, Washington ordered what would become known as the Sullivan Campaign, in which General Sullivan led a group of soldiers to stop Mohawk raids in New York's frontier valley and also to punish the natives who supported the British, which included the Mohawk. Villages were burned along with cornfields and pretty much everything that belonged to the Iroquois who had supported the British. This forced many Mohawk people to escape almost certain death by going deep into the woods near their homes. Joseph Brant and some of his Mohawk supporters were able to escape to Canada. There were only 8,000 Iroquois left after the war, as the nations who had supported the British, and even those who had supported the victorious American rebels, including the Mohawk and the Oneida tribes, had paid a terrible price for entering a war that should not have involved them to begin with.
The Lenni Lenape Indians, also known as the Delaware, was a group of Indians living in parts of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. Despite being a smaller tribe, the choices they made had a significant impact on how the war played out. Unlike many of the other tribes living in the area, the Delaware tribe chose to side with the Americans, a choice they would regret making. The tribe signed a treaty with the newly formed United States, the first treaty passed by the United States since they declared their independence. The treaty allowed American soldiers to move freely through the tribe's territory, and also sell supplies in order to allow their men to enlist in the army. Also included was in the treaty was a major point that enabled the Delaware to establish their own state and have their own representative in Congress, if they chose to in the future. Despite achieving this right, many non-Indians who attended the negotiations suggested that the interpreters were deficient and were deliberately deceptive to benefit the Americans. The representative for Indian Affairs in Pennsylvania at the time was not present at the negotiations and later stated that there was never a conference with the Indians so improperly or villainously conducted. However, the situation divided the tribe, and not all members sided with the Americans. Captain Pipe of the Wolf Clan was opposed to the choices of the other chief, and moved his supporters to the Sandusky River in Ohio, closer to tribes who supported the British. The choice to side with the Americans would prove to be the wrong decision for the Lenni Lenape, and in 1781, a group of Americans attacked the village in Cossacton, Ohio. Not only did the Americans destroy the village, but also destroyed the neighboring village as well. In addition, they captured and brutally killed 15 warriors. Not only were the Delaware attacked by Americans, but the British also took action when they concluded that the tribes were providing food and information to the revolutionaries. The tribe was stripped of their possessions and herded into a concentration camp. After their release in 1782, American soldiers attacked a group of peaceful Lenni Lenape in retaliation for raids done by other tribes. The natives knelt down in prayer while they were brutally executed by the American Rangers. In yet another attack by the Americans, a group living on Smoky Island in Pittsburgh lost their wampum belts and bark books in the confusion of the battle. The loss greatly impacted the tribe and affected the history and oral traditions of the Lenni Lenape forever. The Delaware natives may have sided with the Americans during the war, but the choice ended up costing them not only their villages and family, but resulted in the loss of their history and traditions as well. This happened to many other tribes, and is just one example of the difficult situation the natives went through during the war. The Cherokee Indians who lived in the colonies of North and South Carolina are one of the most well-known and largest tribes. Because of their size and location, they played an essential role during the Revolution and were a sought-after ally for both the British and the American colonists. With some persuasion from other tribes, the Cherokee agreed to side with the British, and each section formulated a three-pronged attack on the towns of the colonists. The Upper Cherokee attacked the North Carolina and Virginia frontiers. The middle towns attacked North Carolina, while the lower towns attacked South Carolina and Georgia. The middle and lower towns had little success, but did succeed in angering the Americans and their armies. After the attacks, General Charles Lee launched a joint punitive expedition which became known as the Cherokee Campaign of 1776. South Carolina troops attacked the lower towns on their way to join forces with the North Carolina troops. The Carolina troops were then able to devastate the middle and valley towns in North Carolina. Virginia troops under Colonel William Christian moved south and crushed the towns in present-day Tennessee. During the Cherokee Campaign, over 50 Cherokee towns were destroyed in the summer of 1776 alone, and any survivors were left without shelter and food. The natives vowed for peace and gave up many of their sacred lands they were holding out from the colonists, which they had lived on for centuries. The campaign also formed a divide between the chiefs and the warriors. While the chiefs were done with the fighting, the warriors withdrew to Tennessee and northern Alabama and continued to fight the Americans. Before the war, the Cherokee were considered to be one of the most powerful tribes aside from the Iroquois, but were quickly devastated due to the overwhelming force of the Americans. The Cherokee were yet another example of a tribe that lost everything during the war and were forced into submission by the colonists.